Hey guys, tonight we are going to travel back to the greatest city of the 19th century, the heart of a global empire, a place of incredible invention, immense wealth, and profound confidence. We are going to Victorian London, but we are not here to visit the Queen or to marvel at the Crystal Palace. We are here to investigate a singular, overwhelming, and deeply unpleasant event that brought this mighty city to its knees. We are here for the Great Stink. Frankly, it's a story that proves that no matter how advanced a civilization becomes, it can still be defeated by a really bad smell. It's a humbling lesson for us all. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. It's always a huge encouragement. For those of you already settled in, I'd love to see where and when you're listening from. Go ahead and drop your city and local time in the comments. I'm recording this late on a Friday night, just before 11 p.m., here in the central United States. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The gentle whir of the fan fades, replaced by the low, constant rumble of a million lives, the sound of iron-shod wheels on cobblestones, and the distant puffing of a steam train. Imagine you are standing on one of London's new, magnificent iron bridges in the middle of the 1850s. The city around you is a marvel of the modern age. It is the capital of the world, the center of finance, industry, and a vast globe-spanning empire. Its population has exploded to over 2 million people, making it the largest city in human history. But as you look down from your bridge, you see the city's great, foul, and inescapable secret: the River Thames. For centuries, the Thames was London's glory, its main artery for commerce and communication. But now it is the city's shame. It is an open sewer. The problem was one of scale. The city's sanitation system was a patchwork of ancient, medieval sewers and covered over rivers that had never been designed to handle the waste of millions of people. For centuries, most of London's human waste went into cesspools in the basements of houses. But as the city grew, these began to overflow. The logical solution at the time was to connect the overflowing cesspools to the existing sewers. And all of these sewers had one and only one destination: the River Thames. The Thames was the city's pride and joy, and also its single largest and most hard-working sewer. It was a multitasking river. It handled global shipping, it provided some of the city's drinking water, and it graciously accepted the untreated waste of 2 million people. Its resume was very impressive, if a little disgusting. Even before the Great Stink, the river was notoriously foul. Scientists of the day described it as a thick, brown, turgid soup, almost entirely devoid of fish or any other life. Along its banks at low tide, a whole class of desperate people known as mudlarks and toshers would wade through the foul-smelling, toxic mud, searching for anything of value: scraps of coal, dropped coins, bits of rope. It was a wretched and dangerous way to make a living. The pay was terrible, and the perks consisted mainly of a high chance of contracting cholera. Historians often debate the public's perception of this problem before the crisis of 1858. Were Londoners simply accustomed to the smell, accepting a foul river as a normal part of big city life? Or was there a growing public health movement and widespread anxiety about the river that the politicians simply ignored? The great irony is that London was choking on its own success. Its booming population, its incredible wealth, its new technologies, these were the very things causing the problem. It was a city with a very modern haircut and very muddy boots. A city that could build the Crystal Palace but couldn't figure out what to do with its own sewage. This already dire situation, this slow-moving environmental catastrophe, was about to be made infinitely worse by a celebrated new invention, a symbol of modern, civilized, and sanitary living. A device that, with every single use, would pour yet more filth into the overburdened heart of the city. Before the Thames became the primary focus of London's woes, the problem was much closer to home. It was a hidden, secret, and deeply fragrant issue that lurked just a few feet beneath the floorboards of nearly every house in the city. It was the age of the cesspool. For centuries, this was the standard of sanitation. In the basement or the back garden of a building, a large pit would be dug, usually lined with bricks. This was the cesspool. And everything, absolutely everything, that went down a drain in the house ended up in this pit. It was a simple, self-contained system. It was also a ticking time bomb. The theory was that the liquid waste would slowly seep out through the porous brick walls into the surrounding soil, a process that sounds much more pleasant than it actually was. In a crowded city like London, this meant that the ground itself was a saturated sponge of human filth. This contaminated the shallow wells from which many Londoners still drew their drinking water, creating a perfect, invisible mechanism for the spread of waterborne diseases like typhoid and, most terrifyingly, cholera. The solid waste, meanwhile, simply accumulated. When a cesspool became full, it had to be emptied. And this led to the creation of one of the most remarkable and pungent professions in Victorian London, the night soilmen. Because the work was so overpoweringly smelly, it was illegal to empty a cesspool during the daylight hours. So, under the cover of darkness, these teams of workers would arrive with their cart and their tools. They were the city's secret sanitation system. Being a night soilman was a tough job. The hours were terrible, the work was unpleasant, and your chances of making friends with people who had a very sensitive nose were extremely low. On the plus side, you were probably always able to get a seat to yourself on the public omnibus. The work was dangerous. The men would have to climb down into the pit, braving the risk of asphyxiation from the noxious fumes, the methane and hydrogen sulfide, that collected in the enclosed space. They would then manually scoop the solid waste, the night soil, into large wooden tubs, which would be hoisted to the surface and dumped into their cart. But this was not just waste. It was wealth. The night soilmen would cart their fragrant cargo out of the city to the surrounding market gardens, where they would sell it for a handsome price as fertilizer. It was the ultimate farm-to-table and then back to the farm system, a perfect, if slightly nauseating ecological loop. London's waste was literally used to grow London's food. Historians debate the economic status of the night soilmen. Were they social outcasts, the most wretched and poorly paid of all laborers? Or because their work was so essential, so unpleasant, and required a certain degree of skill and bravery, did they form a kind of powerful, closed guild that could demand surprisingly high wages for their services? The evidence suggests that a master night soilman could, in fact, earn a very good living. But this medieval system could not cope with the explosive growth of the 19th century. There were simply too many people producing too much waste. The cesspools were overflowing. The night soilmen couldn't keep up. The city was beginning to drown in its own filth. And so, in the 1840s, a great sanitary reformer named Edwin Chadwick championed what seemed like a brilliant and modern solution. He pushed through laws that mandated that all houses should be connected to the existing sewer system. The goal was to get the filth out of the basements and away from the people. It seemed like a wonderful idea at the time. Get the terrible smell out of the houses and into the sewers. Problem solved. Unfortunately, no one gave much thought to the next logical step in that journey. All of London's sewers emptied directly into the Thames. They had successfully taken the waste from thousands of small, private, hidden cesspools and diverted it all into one very large, very public one. And the popularization of a brand new, modern, and exciting invention was about to turn this already terrible situation into a true catastrophe. The final, crucial ingredient in London's impending environmental disaster was, ironically, a celebrated symbol of progress. It was a mark of a modern, civilized, and sanitary home. It was the flushing water closet. The toilet invented much earlier, the flushing toilet only became a fashionable, must-have item for the burgeoning middle class after the Great Exhibition of 1851, held in the magnificent Crystal Palace in Hyde Park. This great festival of industry and progress showcased wonders from all over the world. But one of its most popular and talked about exhibits was the public water closets. For the price of a single penny, visitors could use a clean, flushing toilet for the first time in their lives. Hundreds of thousands of people did so, and it was a revelation compared to the smelly, unhygienic privy at the bottom of the garden, or the chamber pot under the bed. The flushing toilet seemed like a miracle of modern science. It was clean. It was odorless. It magically washed all the unpleasantness away. And so, in the years following the Great Exhibition, a craze for installing them swept through London's wealthier homes. But this miracle of private, domestic cleanliness had a catastrophic and unforeseen public consequence. The old cesspool system, for all its many flaws, was primarily designed to handle solid waste. The new flushing toilets used immense quantities of water, several gallons with every single flush. And the recent sanitary reforms had mandated that all of these new toilets, and all the old cesspools, should be connected directly to the city's ancient sewer system. The result was a disaster. The massive influx of water from thousands of new toilets acted like a power hose, scouring out the decades, even centuries, of accumulated solid waste that had been festering in the city's cesspools and sewers. This great, concentrated wave of filth, along with all the new waste being produced every day, was funneled directly into the one place it had to go, the River Thames. Every proud homeowner who installed a new, state-of-the-art flushing toilet, believing they were making their home cleaner and more modern, was in reality just becoming a more efficient and high-volume contributor to the death of their city's main waterway. It was progress, but in entirely the wrong direction. By the 1850s, the river was, for all intents and purposes, biologically dead. The volume of raw, untreated sewage pouring into it every day was so immense that the natural currents could no longer wash it out to sea. It just sloshed back and forth with the tides, a thick, brown, fermenting soup. Bubbles of methane gas would erupt on its surface, and the banks at low tide were coated in a thick, black, stinking slime several feet deep. The authorities were aware of the problem, in their own way. By this time, the river was so notoriously foul that Parliament had passed laws making it illegal for factories to dump certain types of industrial and chemical waste into it. But it was still perfectly legal, and in fact legally mandated, to dump the entire city's human waste into the river. It seems industrial pollution was considered a crime, but turning the Thames into a giant public toilet was considered city planning. Historians of technology often discuss the concept of unforeseen consequences, and the London sewer crisis is a textbook example. Did the sanitary reformers who, with the best of intentions, ordered the cesspools to be emptied into the river, have any idea of the ecological disaster they were about to unleash? Or were they acting from a genuine desire to clean up the city's homes, unable to foresee the catastrophic citywide scale of the problem they were creating? The stage was now perfectly set for a catastrophe. You had an ancient sewer system, never designed for its new purpose. You had a massive, still-growing population. You had a new law forcing every house to discharge its waste into that system. And you had a new and very popular invention that was flushing unprecedented volumes of water and waste into that system every single day. The River Thames was now like a giant chemistry experiment that had gone horribly wrong. All the components were there for a truly spectacular result. The only thing missing was the final catalyst, a little bit of heat. And in the spring of 1858, that final ingredient arrived. The weather turned warm, and the rains, which normally would have helped to dilute the river's contents, simply stopped. The spring of 1858 is unusually dry. The gentle, persistent drizzle that is the hallmark of a London spring simply does not arrive. Then, as May turns into June, the heat begins. It is not a pleasant, gentle warmth. It is a relentless, oppressive, and almost tropical heat wave that settles over the city like a heavy, suffocating wool blanket. Day after day, the sun blazes from a cloudless, hazy sky. The brick and stone of the city's buildings absorb the heat, radiating it back into the narrow, airless streets. Londoners, accustomed to a mild, damp climate, suffer terribly. They try to find relief in the city's great parks, or they flock to the banks of the River Thames, hoping for a cool breeze off the water. But the river offers no relief. In fact, the river is the very source of the problem. The combination of the drought and the heat has a catastrophic effect on the already overburdened Thames. With no rain to swell its banks, the flow of fresh water from upstream slows to a pathetic trickle. The overall water level of the river drops, exposing vast, foul-smelling banks of thick, black, sewage-laden mud on either side. These mud banks, now baking in the relentless summer sun, begin to release their fragrant secrets into the air. Worse still is what is happening in the river itself. The lack of fresh water means that the millions of gallons of raw, untreated sewage being pumped into the river each day is no longer being diluted or washed out to sea. It becomes a thick, concentrated, and slow-moving sludge. And in the unprecedented heat, the water temperature rises. The river, in essence, begins to cook. The intense heat dramatically accelerates the anaerobic decomposition of the organic waste. The entire River Thames, for a length of several miles through the heart of London, begins to ferment under the summer sun. First, Londoners did what they always did when something smelled unpleasant. They tried their best to ignore it. A bad smell in 19th century London was not exactly front-page news. It was for the most part just the smell of the air. But this new smell was different. It had ambition. It had scope. It had a power and a pungency that could not be ignored. It was a physical presence in the city, a thick, foul miasma that seemed to coat the back of your throat. In the years leading up to 1858, there had been dozens of proposals and schemes to clean up the river. Some were grand, like the popular idea of building a great dam to create a huge artificial lake, in the mistaken belief that more water would solve the problem. Others were more simplistic, like the plan to simply dump vast quantities of chalk or chloride of lime directly into the river, hoping to deodorize it. This was the 19th century equivalent of just spraying a lot of air freshener in a room instead of actually taking out the garbage. It was a temporary and ultimately doomed strategy. Environmental historians often debate whether the Great Stink was a sudden freak event caused by a unique combination of weather conditions, or if it was the inevitable and predictable culmination of decades of pollution, mismanagement, and political inaction. The numerous parliamentary commissions and scientific reports on the dreadful state of the Thames in the years prior suggest that many officials were well aware of the looming catastrophe. They just couldn't agree or bring themselves to spend the money on a solution. The city begins to suffer. Business on the river, the hundreds of watermen who ferried people from one bank to the other, grinds to a halt. No one wants to be near the water. The smell is inescapable. It seeps through closed doors and shuttered windows. It seems to get into the very fabric of your clothes, your hair, your food. The great stinking river, in its fragrant wisdom, had chosen to unleash its greatest fury upon the most densely populated part of the city. And flowing directly through the heart of this most affected area, its grand Gothic towers rising from the very riverbank itself, was the most powerful and important building in the entire British Empire, the Houses of Parliament. The problem was about to come knocking, quite literally, on the government's door. And a famous, highly respected scientist was about to take a boat trip that would turn this public nuisance into a national scandal. In early June of 1858, as the heat wave tightened its grip and the smell from the river grew from a local nuisance into a citywide affliction, one of the most famous and respected scientists in the world decided to conduct a simple and very public experiment. His name was Michael Faraday. Faraday was a brilliant, self-made man, a giant in the world of physics, famous for his groundbreaking work in electromagnetism and electrochemistry. He was also a concerned citizen of London, and he had been observing the horrifying decline of the city's great river for years. He decided it was time to make a statement. Imagine you are there with him as he boards a steamboat for a journey through the heart of the city, from London Bridge down to Hungerford Bridge. The purpose of his trip is to observe and to document. But the first thing that strikes you is the smell. It is a physical assault on the senses. And for the people of London, this smell carried with it a particular and profound terror. This was not just because it was unpleasant. It was because they believed it was deadly. London was a city haunted by the memory of cholera. Great terrifying epidemics had swept through the city in recent decades, killing tens of thousands of people in a horrible, swift, and seemingly random fashion. No one knew what caused it, but the prevailing scientific theory of the day was the miasma theory. Doctors and scientists believed that cholera and other diseases were spread by a miasma, a poisonous, foul-smelling vapor that rose from decomposing organic matter. And the single greatest source of this foul air in the entire city was the River Thames. To a Victorian Londoner, the Great Stink was not a nuisance. It was the smell of a new plague waiting to happen. It's hard to enjoy a pleasant boat trip when you believe every breath of river air you take might be carrying a fatal disease. It really puts a damper on the sightseeing. Is in this context of fear that Faraday performs his experiment. He has with him a supply of ordinary white paper cards. As the steamboat churns through the thick, brown, soupy water, he begins to drop the cards one by one into the river. He is testing the river's opacity. The result is shocking. The white cards disappear from view instantly, before they have sunk more than a single inch beneath the surface. The river was so thick with filth that it was, for all intents and purposes, opaque. It was the ultimate scientific test for how gross is this river? The answer was very, very gross. So gross that it failed the "can you see a piece of paper in it" test, which is a very low bar for a body of water to clear. A few days later, Faraday wrote a powerful, scathing letter to the Times newspaper describing his findings. "The whole of the river was an opaque pale brown fluid," he wrote. "The smell was very bad and common to the whole of the water. It was the same as that which now comes up from the gulls of the streets. The whole river was for the time a real sewer." His letter was a sensation. It was a public shaming of the government, written by the most respected scientific mind in the country. The newspaper seized upon the story. Cartoons began to appear depicting Father Thames as a skeletal monster, rising from the filth to threaten the city. The great irony, which historians of science now appreciate, is that the miasma theory was completely wrong. A few years earlier, in 1854, a brilliant doctor named John Snow had conclusively proven that cholera was a waterborne disease, spread not by smell, but by drinking water contaminated with sewage. But his groundbreaking work was not yet accepted by the medical establishment. So everyone was panicking for the wrong reason. They were terrified of the smell, when they should have been terrified of the water. Luckily, the solution to both problems was the same. Stop dumping sewage into the river. Sometimes you get the right answer, even if you show your work incorrectly on the exam. Faraday's letter ignited a firestorm of public outcry and political pressure. The government could no longer ignore the problem. The health of the city and the reputation of the nation were at stake. And as the month of June wore on, the heat wave continued, and the stench grew even worse. A new front in the battle was about to open. The Great Stink itself was about to make a very personal and very unwelcome visit to the halls of power. Faraday's letter turns the state of the Thames from a well-known problem into a national scandal. The newspapers are having a field day. But letters, scientific reports, and even scathing editorial cartoons are things that politicians are very good at ignoring. What they could not ignore, however, was the direct, physical, and profoundly smelly arrival of the problem at their own front door. Imagine the scene. You are standing before the newly rebuilt Palace of Westminster, the home of the British Parliament. It is a magnificent, awe-inspiring Gothic revival masterpiece, a symphony of spires, towers, and intricate stonework. It is the very symbol of British power, stability, and imperial grandeur. It also has one single catastrophic design flaw. It was built directly on the northern bank of the River Thames. Its grand riverfront terrace, its elegant dining rooms, and hundreds of its committee room windows look directly out over the source of the Great Stink. Worse still, the palace's modern ventilation system, in a feat of what can only be described as tragic irony, had been designed to draw in fresh air from the riverside of the building. In the middle of June 1858, as the heat wave reached its peak, this design flaw became an existential crisis for the government of the largest empire on Earth. The smell, which had been a general citywide affliction, now became a concentrated, weaponized assault on the very heart of the British establishment. The stench, rising from the cooking sewage of the Thames, was sucked in by the ventilation system and pumped directly into the hallowed halls of Parliament. The effect was immediate and devastating. It's hard to engage in a spirited debate about a new bill concerning the administration of India when the very air you are breathing smells like a medieval sewer has caught fire. The official parliamentary records from that summer, known as Hansard, are filled with bitter and desperate complaints. Members of Parliament rose to speak, not about politics, but about the pestilential condition and the nauseous effluvia rising from the river. The government, quite literally, began to grind to a halt. The law courts, which were held in Westminster Hall, had to be abandoned on the worst days, with judges and lawyers fleeing the building, clutching handkerchiefs to their faces. Attendance in the great debating chambers of the House of Commons and the House of Lords plummeted. It was a crisis. Historians often debate the true motivation for Parliament's eventual and very swift action to solve the problem. Was it a moment of enlightened, altruistic concern for the public health of the citizens of London? Or was it purely a matter of self-interest? Did they finally act only because the problem, which had been killing the poor in other districts for decades, had now become a direct, personal, and unavoidable inconvenience for the lawmakers themselves? The initial response was not action but panic. A committee was formed to investigate the source of the smell, which was a bit redundant, as the source was 10 feet from their own windows. The most popular proposal was to simply abandon the capital altogether. The Prime Minister, Lord Derby, seriously suggested moving the entire government and all its business to Oxford, or perhaps St. Albans, until the smell went away. It was a bold strategy of tactical retreat. Gentlemen, we cannot defeat this enemy. I suggest we abandon the capital and regroup in a less smelly town. But the great stink was a great equalizer. It afflicted the wealthy lord in his ermine robes just as much as it did the poorest mudlark on the riverbank. For the first time, the ruling class of the most powerful nation on earth was being forced to experience the direct, unfiltered consequences of decades of their own neglect. You can just imagine a powerful duke, who had likely never had to think about sanitation a single day in his life, getting his first real whiff of the Thames from his magnificent office window. Good heavens! What is that appalling odor? And his long-suffering assistant replying, "That, my lord, is what we call consequences." Running away was not a practical long-term solution. The government could not abandon its capital. They had to stand and fight. And so, in their desperation, they turned to a popular chemical of the day, a substance they believed could purify the air and defeat the monstrous stench. Their first great counterattack was about to begin. It would be a battle fought not with weapons and soldiers, but with a great deal of fabric and a whole lot of lime. With the desperate plan to abandon London proving impractical, the government turned to a more direct, if equally futile, solution. They decided to fight the smell not by running away from it, but by trying to purify it. They decided to fight the great stink with chemistry, or at least with what passed for chemistry in the popular imagination of the time. Their weapon of choice was chloride of lime, a substance more commonly known as bleaching powder. It was a popular disinfectant and deodorizer in the 19th century, and it possessed a powerful, sharp, chlorine-like smell of its own. According to the prevailing miasma theory, which held that disease was caused by foul air, it was believed that a strong, clean, chemical smell could actively neutralize and destroy the bad, disease-carrying smells rising from the river, and so a truly remarkable plan was hatched. They decided to soak the magnificent, heavy velvet curtains of the Houses of Parliament in a solution of chloride of lime. The idea was that these enormous chemically drenched drapes, hanging in every window, would act as a great filter. The foul miasma from the river would have to pass through them to enter the building, and in doing so, it would be rendered clean and harmless. This really happened. The official records for the summer of 1858 show immense government expenditure on vast quantities of chloride of lime for this very purpose. You have to imagine the scene. Teams of workers, their eyes watering from the fumes, hauling the colossal, sodden curtains and rehanging them in the grand, Gothic window frames. The result was not the fresh, clean air that the politicians had hoped for. The result was a new, monstrous, and arguably even worse hybrid smell. It was a smell that had all the worst, most foul organic qualities of a medieval sewer, now combined with the sharp, acrid, and deeply unpleasant sting of an industrial chemical. It did not solve the problem. It just made the problem smell more complicated. The great stink was simply too powerful. It passed through the curtains as if they weren't there, now carrying with it a hint of chlorine, and continued its relentless assault on the members of Parliament. The only tangible effect of the great curtain-soaking experiment was that the beautiful, expensive fabrics were being slowly bleached and ruined by the corrosive chemical. At the same time, the government was fighting a second front in this chemical war. They ordered barges to dump vast quantities of chalk and lime directly into the Thames at the mouths of the great sewers, hoping to deodorize the river at its source. This too was a massively expensive and almost completely useless endeavor. The sheer volume of sewage pouring into the river every hour was so immense that any deodorizing effect was instantly overwhelmed. It was like using a single bucket of water to put out a forest fire. The government was attacking the smell at the source by turning the river into a failed chemistry experiment, and they were defending their own building with the power of smelly, dissolving curtains. The great stink was winning the war on both fronts. Decisively, historians of science see this episode as a fascinating clash between a flawed theory and a chemical reality. The MPs, guided by the miasma theory, believed they were fighting a bad air with a good air. What they were actually doing was attempting a chemical neutralization on an industrial scale, without any real understanding of the quantities or reactions involved. It was a moment of peak scientific misunderstanding. The failure of the lime-soaked curtains was a crucial turning point. It represented the final humiliating defeat of all the temporary, superficial, and half-baked solutions. The government had tried to ignore the problem. They had tried to run away from it. Now they had tried to cover it up with an even stronger smell. And nothing had worked. They were out of options. The stench was as bad as ever. The government could not function, and the newspapers were mocking their pathetic efforts. There's nothing quite like a massive, expensive, and profoundly embarrassing failure to focus the mind. With their buildings still uninhabitable and their grand curtains slowly being ruined, the politicians of the greatest empire on earth finally came to a simple, humbling conclusion. They could not mask the smell. They had to actually solve the problem that was causing it. But to understand their panic and their strange faith in these chemical solutions, you have to understand the terror of the theory that was driving their every decision. To understand the great stink, you first have to understand the great miasma. To understand the panic of 1858, to truly grasp the frantic fear that gripped the most powerful men in London and forced them into action, you have to understand the scientific theory that haunted their world. You have to understand the miasma theory. Today we know that many of the most devastating diseases are spread by microscopic germs, bacteria, and viruses. But in the middle of the 19th century, the germ theory of disease was a fringe and unproven idea. The dominant, accepted, and entirely logical scientific consensus was the miasma theory. The theory, which had its roots in the medicine of the ancient Greeks, held that diseases like cholera, typhus, and even the Black Death were caused by a miasma. A miasma was a poisonous, invisible vapor, a bad air, that rose from decaying organic matter. It was believed that when you smelled the foul odor of a swamp, a garbage heap, or a polluted river, you were literally inhaling the disease itself. The smell and the sickness were one and the same, and it was a theory that made perfect intuitive sense. For centuries, people had observed a clear and undeniable correlation. The poorest, dirtiest, and smelliest parts of a city were always the places where disease was most rampant. The conclusion seemed obvious. The foul air in these places was what was making people sick. It was a perfectly logical deduction based on the available evidence. It just happened to be completely wrong. The miasma theory was not a folk belief. It was the mainstream scientific and medical orthodoxy of its day, championed by the leading sanitary reformers of the age, people like Florence Nightingale and Edwin Chadwick. The competing germ theory, which would later be proven by the brilliant work of Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch, would not become widely accepted for another 20 years. This belief in miasma created a profound and pervasive terror. If a disease is carried on the air, in a foul-smelling cloud, then there is no real escape. A wealthy nobleman could live in a grand, clean house, but if the wind shifted and a foul breeze from a nearby slum or from the river itself blew through his open window, he and his family could be struck down. And so the Great Stink of 1858 was not just an unbearable nuisance. In the minds of the 2 million people living in London, it was a tangible citywide airborne plague waiting to happen. It was the smell of death. It's a terrifying idea. It turns every bad odor into a potential assassin. A strange whiff from the drains, a foul smell from the street, it could be the end. It's enough to make you want to live your life inside a giant sealed jar. This theory also dictated the prescribed methods of prevention and cure. If bad air caused disease, then good air must be the remedy. This is why the politicians in Parliament believed so strongly in their lime-soaked curtains. They were fighting a bad smell with a strong, clean chemical smell. It is also why, during earlier plagues, doctors wore those famous beaked masks. The beaks were stuffed with fragrant herbs, flowers, and perfumes, a personal air filter designed to protect the doctor from the deadly miasma of his patients. People would burn bonfires in the streets to purify the air with smoke, or carry perfumed handkerchiefs, known as pomanders, to hold to their noses. So the official medical advice was to fight the killer smell by filling your life with other, stronger smells. It probably didn't do much for the cholera, but it must have made London an even more interesting place to smell. Historians of science often debate whether the miasma theory was, on the whole, a force for good or for bad. While its central premise was incorrect, its practical effects were often hugely beneficial. It was the belief in miasma that drove the great sanitary reformers of the 19th century to demand the cleanup of cities, the removal of filth, the provision of fresh water, and the creation of parks and open spaces. This great sanitary awakening, as it was called, saved countless lives. Even though it was motivated by a flawed scientific understanding, it is one of history's great examples of getting the right answer for the wrong reason. And the Great Stink was, in the minds of the terrified Victorians, the ultimate miasmatic event. It was the largest, most powerful, and most inescapable bad smell the city had ever produced. Faced with what they believed to be the single greatest cloud of airborne death in recorded history, the politicians' usual strategy of forming a committee and hoping the problem goes away suddenly seemed woefully inadequate. The terror inspired by the miasma theory was the final crucial ingredient. It was the force that broke the political deadlock and overcame the government's deep-seated reluctance to spend money. They were now desperate. They were ready to listen to anyone who had a credible, large-scale plan to get rid of the smell, and to do it quickly. And as it happened, there was one man, an engineer, who had been patiently waiting for years with just such a plan. The moment of crisis had arrived. The government was paralyzed by the stench. Their desperate, comical attempts to fight the smell with chemistry had failed. They needed a real solution, not another committee meeting or another shipment of lime. And into this moment of fragrant desperation and political chaos steps the quiet, unlikely hero of our story. His name was Joseph Bazalgette. He was not a charismatic politician, a fiery orator, or a famous scientist. He was a civil engineer. And he was, in every respect, the perfect picture of a respectable, professional, mid-Victorian gentleman. He was impeccably dressed, and he sported a truly magnificent set of mustaches. But beneath this calm and conventional exterior was a mind of brilliant clarity and a will of pure, unbending iron. While the politicians in Westminster had been arguing, panicking, and soaking their curtains, Joseph Bazalgette had been quietly and methodically doing his job. As the chief engineer for London's Metropolitan Board of Works, a position he had held for 2 years, the city's infrastructure was his direct responsibility. The sanitation crisis was not a surprise to him. He had spent years studying the problem, surveying the city, and drawing up a solution. A vast, breathtakingly ambitious, and incredibly detailed solution. He was a man of science and mathematics, not of passionate speeches. He came from a family of engineers and had made his name during the railway mania of the 1840s, a period of intense and chaotic railway construction all across Britain. That experience managing huge, complex infrastructure projects with thousands of workers and immense budgets was the perfect training for the task that now lay before him. There's a story that early in his career, Bazalgette had suffered a complete physical and nervous collapse from overwork, an illness that almost killed him. This experience seems to have forged in him a kind of profound, almost unshakable patience. He was a man who understood the value of careful, deliberate work, and he was not a man to be flustered by panic or political pressure. Having a complete breakdown from overwork early in your career is probably a good way to learn your limits. After that, dealing with a parliament full of terrified, smelly politicians must have seemed like a relaxing holiday by comparison. Biographers and historians often debate the precise nature of Bazalgette's genius. Was he a once-in-a-generation visionary who single-handedly dreamed up the entire brilliant plan? Or was he a masterful project manager and synthesizer? A man with the skill to take the best ideas from a decade of competing engineering proposals and weld them into a single, coherent, and practical master plan? His true gift was likely the latter. He was the man who could turn years of chaotic theory and debate into a single, elegant, and actionable blueprint. And so, when the Great Stink finally forced the government's hand, Bazalgette did not have to invent a solution. He just had to open his desk drawer. His plan in all its detailed glory was already there waiting. It must have been the ultimate "I told you so" moment for an engineer. For years, politicians had likely told him that his grand sewer plan was too ambitious, too complicated, and, above all, far too expensive. Now, with the very air of their debating chambers turned into a toxic soup, they were practically begging him for it. Every engineer in the world dreams of a moment of such profound and fragrant vindication, and so, in the final desperate days of June 1858, Joseph Bazalgette was summoned to appear before a special parliamentary committee. Imagine the scene. A grand Gothic room, its windows sealed shut, the air thick with the competing stenches of the river and chloride of lime. A group of the most powerful men in the country, their faces pale with heat and nausea, are seated around a great table. And into this room walks the calm, professional, and magnificently mustachioed engineer. He is carrying a large, rolled-up set of blueprints. The frantic, defeated politicians now turn their full attention to this quiet man. He is their last and only hope. He is about to present his grand but beautifully simple idea. Joseph Bazalgette unrolls his great, master map of London across the committee room table. The politicians, their faces pale in the gaslight, lean forward, handkerchiefs still pressed to their noses. They are expecting perhaps some complex new chemical formula, some miraculous way to deodorize the river. What Bazalgette shows them is something far more powerful and far more permanent. He shows them a plan based on elegant, simple, and brilliant plumbing. He begins by explaining the problem in a way that even a politician can understand. He points out on the map how all of London's existing sewers, most of them old, covered over rivers like the Fleet or the Tyburn, run from north to south, downhill towards the river. And every single one, he explains, dumps its contents directly into the Thames at the lowest point in the city. The river is a sump. This is the fundamental catastrophic design flaw. Then, with a pencil, he reveals his solution. It is a concept of breathtaking scale and beautiful simplicity. He proposes to build a small number of new, massive brick-lined sewers. But these new sewers will not run downhill towards the river. They will run from west to east, perpendicular to the old sewers. They will be the intercepting sewers. The idea is that these new, great tunnels will literally intercept the contents of the old sewers just before they can reach the river. The filth of London will be captured, diverted, and sent on a new journey, and the genius of the system is how it will be powered. These new tunnels will not be flat. They will be constructed with a slight, but continuous downward gradient. A gentle slope, a drop of just 2 feet for every mile. The sewage of London, he explains, will be carried eastwards, away from the city, by the single most reliable and free power source in the universe, the force of gravity. The plan was the most ambitious civic engineering project the world had ever seen. It called for 82 miles of these massive main intercepting sewers, which would in turn connect to over 1,000 miles of new local street sewers, creating a completely new hidden circulatory system for the city. The politicians ask where it will all go. Bazalgette traces the path on the map. The sewage will be carried far to the east of London, to great outfalls at Beckton on the north bank and Crossness on the south. Here it will be held in enormous reservoirs, and then, and only then, will it be released into the Thames on the outgoing tide, to be carried safely and harmlessly out to sea. The plan was basically to stop dumping the problem on your own doorstep, and instead to very efficiently dump it on your neighbor's doorstep several miles downriver. The people of East London were probably less than thrilled about the idea, but the politicians in Westminster thought it was magnificent. For the low-lying parts of the city, where gravity was not enough, he planned for the construction of massive steam-powered pumping stations to lift the sewage up to the level of the main outflow tunnels. Even the shape of the tunnels themselves was a work of quiet genius. Bazalgette shows them a diagram. The sewers will not be simple round pipes. They will be a distinctive egg shape, narrower at the bottom. He explains that this shape concentrates the flow of water. Even a small amount of liquid will create a deep, fast-moving channel at the bottom of the egg, which will scour away silt and debris, making the entire system self-cleaning. It's one of those brilliant, simple ideas that makes you think, why didn't I think of that? And then you remember you're not a genius Victorian engineer, and you just go back to being impressed. Engineering historians see Bazalgette's design as a masterful synthesis of ancient principles and modern technology. The Roman use of gravity to move water over vast distances was a clear historical precedent, but Bazalgette's application of this idea to a complex, citywide sewer network, integrated with the world's most powerful steam pumps, was a truly modern innovation. Bazalgette calmly explains all of this to the committee. He has an answer for every question. He has calculated every gradient. He has mapped every street. His quiet, unshakable competence is a balm to their panicked souls. The politicians are stunned. They came here looking for a magic spell to make the smell go away. Instead, they have been given a masterclass in fluid dynamics and brickwork. It was probably the most practical and useful presentation they had heard all year. The plan is brilliant. It is elegant. It is comprehensive. But it is also vast, and it will be astronomically expensive. A cautious politician speaks up. The plan seems sound for the London of today, he says. But London is growing at an incredible rate. What about the future? Will this new system be able to cope with the London of 100 years from now? Bazalgette looks at the politician and gives the answer that will cement his legacy as a true visionary. The politician's question hangs in the smelly air of the committee room. It is a perfectly reasonable and fiscally responsible question. This grand plan will cost millions of pounds, an astronomical sum for the time. How can they be certain that this fantastically expensive new system will not itself be overwhelmed in 50 or 100 years, forcing a future generation to go through this whole terrible, stinking mess all over again? Joseph Bazalgette looks at the man. He does not present a complex chart of statistical projections. He simply explains his philosophy, a philosophy born of the supreme confidence and ambition of the Victorian era. The story that has come down through history, a story that is perhaps too good to be a literal quote but is absolutely true in its spirit, is that Bazalgette took the most generous, most optimistic estimate of London's future population growth. He then calculated the diameter of the sewer pipes that would be needed to serve that future, much larger city. And then he turned to his draftsman and gave a simple, legendary instruction. Well, we're only going to do this once. Gentlemen, double the diameter. This was the stroke of true genius. This was what elevated Bazalgette from a competent engineer into a genuine visionary. He was not just solving the problem of the Great Stink of 1858. He was solving the problem of a London that did not yet exist, a city twice as large and twice as dense as anyone could possibly imagine it becoming. It was an act of incredible, expensive, and ultimately heroic foresight. And while the exact quote may be a legend, the principle is absolutely true. Bazalgette designed his entire system with enormous, almost ludicrous excess capacity. The main intercepting sewers were not mere pipes. They were great subterranean cathedrals of brick, some of them over 11 feet high, large enough for a horse-drawn omnibus to drive through. It is this massive over-engineering, this decision to double the diameter, that is the primary reason why his system, built to serve a Victorian city of 4 million people, is to this day still functioning as the backbone of modern London's sanitation system. A city of nearly 9 million, that it's a principle that should be applied to all major life projects. Building a new bookshelf for your paperbacks? Double the size. Making yourself a sandwich for lunch? Double the cheese. Bazalgette understood that when it comes to infrastructure and possibly sandwiches, it is always better to have too much than not enough. This was not a cheap decision. Doubling the diameter of a circular pipe more than quadruples its capacity and dramatically increases the cost of materials and labor. He was asking the politicians to spend a fortune on solving a problem that did not yet exist, for a city that was purely hypothetical. But in the sweltering, stinking summer of 1858, with the miasma of a potential plague seeping through their very windows, the politicians were in no mood to argue about the future. They were desperate for a solution for the present. Bazalgette was the ultimate pessimist, in the best possible way. His entire design philosophy was, assume the absolute worst will happen, and then build something that can handle twice that. He designed the sewers to cope not just with the city's waste, but also with the immense volume of water from a catastrophic rainstorm, ensuring the system would not be overwhelmed. It is a very reassuring philosophy when you are talking about the sanitation of a great city. Economists and urban planners today still debate the concept of over-engineering in modern infrastructure. Is it a wise long-term investment, as Bazalgette's great sewers so clearly proved to be? Or is it an inefficient use of public funds, building massive capacity that may never be needed, when that money could be used for other, more immediate social problems? The London sewers stand as the great historical monument in favor of thinking big, thanks to Joseph Bazalgette and his commitment to doubling the diameter. Generations of Londoners in the 20th and 21st centuries have been able to flush their toilets with a blissful confidence they simply do not deserve. They are all enjoying the benefits of one man's quiet, rational decision to be extra cautious over 150 years ago. Back in the committee room, the politicians are awed by the sheer scale and confidence of his vision. He has presented them with a plan that is not just a fix, but a permanent solution, a legacy for the ages. They are convinced. The quiet, mustachioed engineer has won the day. Now, all that remains is for the great creaking machine of British politics to make it official, and to provide the money. Armed with Joseph Bazalgette's confident and comprehensive plan, the politicians of Westminster now had a clear path forward. All that was needed was the political will to act, and the great stink, which continued to torment them daily, was an incredibly powerful motivator. The man of the hour was the Chancellor of the Exchequer, a brilliant, witty, and deeply pragmatic politician named Benjamin Disraeli. As the keeper of the nation's purse, he was normally the man most likely to argue against any massive public expenditure. But Disraeli was also a shrewd political operator who understood that this was a moment of crisis that required a bold solution. He recognized that the Great Stink was not just a public health issue, it was an embarrassment to the capital of the British Empire, and so in the sweltering, smelly month of July 1858, the government introduced a new bill to Parliament, the Metropolis Local Management Amendment Act. The bill was simple. It would grant Bazalgette's Metropolitan Board of Works the authority and, crucially, the money to begin construction of the new sewer system immediately. The sum requested was £3 million, an almost unimaginable amount of money at the time, equivalent to many billions of dollars today. In the normal, leisurely world of Victorian politics, a bill of this magnitude would have been debated for months or even years. It would have been picked apart in committees, stalled by arguments over cost, and used as a political football by the opposition. But this was not a normal time. The Great Stink had its own timetable. It turns out that the single most effective tool for achieving cross-party political consensus is an apocalyptic, all-pervasive bad smell. Years of debate were settled in just a few weeks, all because the members of Parliament could no longer stand to be in their own offices. Disraeli himself championed the bill in the House of Commons. In a famous speech, he rose and declared the Thames to be a Stygian pool, reeking with ineffable and unbearable horrors. He brilliantly framed the enormous cost not as an expense, but as a necessary investment in the health, honor, and prestige of the greatest city in the world. He managed to turn a massive public spending bill for a new plumbing system into a rousing speech about national pride and defeating a monstrous enemy. He made spending £3 million on sewers sound like a glorious military victory. The result was astonishing. The bill flew through the House of Commons. It was passed to the House of Lords, who, also suffering from the same terrible stench, approved it with similar speed. And just 18 days after it was first introduced, the bill was given royal assent by Queen Victoria. It was now law. A legislative process that should have taken years had been completed in less than 3 weeks. Political historians see this moment as a major turning point in Victorian society. Was this the moment that the traditional, hands-off, laissez-faire ideology of small government finally gave way to a new understanding that the massive problems of a modern industrial city required massive state-funded solutions? The sewer bill was one of the largest and most ambitious acts of direct government intervention in a generation, and it was a model that would be followed for decades to come. The newspapers, which just a week before had been publishing cartoons of politicians as rats fleeing a stinking, sinking ship, were now filled with praise for the government's bold and decisive action. Nothing, it seems, improves a politician's approval rating quite like a credible promise to make the entire city smell better. Joseph Bazalgette now had everything he needed. He had his plan, he had the full backing of the law, and he had his £3 million. The political and theoretical battles were over. The drawings on his desk, the elegant lines on his great map, were about to become a reality, but the laws and the blueprints were just the beginning. Now came the truly monumental task. The digging. The work of transforming London would not be done in the gilded halls of Westminster, but in the muddy, dangerous trenches that would soon be carved through the city's streets. An army of workers was about to be assembled to begin construction on the largest and most difficult engineering project the world had ever seen. The debate in Parliament is over. The money is secured. Now the quiet, theoretical work of the engineer must give way to the loud, dirty, and dangerous work of the builder. The great project to save London begins, and to build it, the city will need an army. Not an army of soldiers with rifles, but an army of laborers with shovels and pickaxes. This was the age of the navvy. The navvies, the name a shortened form of navigator, from their earlier work digging the great navigation canals of the 18th century, were the legendary workforce that built the infrastructure of Victorian Britain. They were the men who laid the thousands of miles of railway tracks, dug the canals, and built the bridges and tunnels of the industrial age. They were known for their immense physical strength, their prodigious capacity for work, and their famously rough, hard-drinking, and independent lifestyle. They were the human-powered bulldozers of their time, and they were paid much, much less. Tens of thousands of these men were hired for the Great Sewer Project. For the next decade, London would become their workplace. The construction was a massive, disruptive undertaking. In many areas, the cut-and-cover method was used. A massive deep trench would be dug, right down the middle of a major street. The great, egg-shaped brick sewer would be constructed at the bottom, and then the trench would be filled back in and the road rebuilt. For years, London was a city of impassable streets, enormous trenches, and mountains of excavated earth. The work was incredibly dangerous. The navvies toiled in deep, muddy trenches, shored up with flimsy-looking timber supports. The risk of a cave-in was constant. As they tunneled deep beneath the city, they could hit pockets of natural gas, or even worse, accidentally break into one of the older existing sewers, releasing a sudden toxic flood. Many men were killed or seriously injured during the construction, their names lost to history, the unsung casualties in the war against filth. There were specialists within the ranks of this great army. At the head of a tunnel being bored deep underground were the miners, the most skilled and highly paid navvies, who would dig out the earth by hand in the dark, cramped, and terrifying conditions. Behind them came the bricklayers, the master craftsmen who, working by the dim light of a candle or an oil lamp, would lay the millions of bricks that formed the sewer's strong, curved walls. Being a sewer bricklayer was a highly respected trade. You had to be able to work in the dark, in a damp, enclosed space, and lay bricks perfectly to create the complex egg shape. Also, the view from your office was consistently terrible. Social historians often debate the cultural impact of the navvies on Victorian society. Were they seen as heroic, muscular figures, the noble laborers who were building the new modern Britain? Or were they feared and shunned by the respectable middle classes, seen as a lawless, rootless, and disruptive underclass who brought drunkenness and brawling with them wherever they went? The truth is likely a mixture of both. They were admired for their strength and skill, but their presence was often a source of anxiety for the polite society whose city they were remaking from the ground up. The people of London had complained bitterly about the smell. Now they had a new set of things to complain about: the constant noise, the closed roads, the dust, and the general chaos of living in the middle of the world's largest construction site. I can't get my carriage down the Strand because they're digging another one of Mr. Bazalgette's giant, smelly egg tunnels. Progress, as always, is deeply inconvenient. But the work continued relentlessly. Day after day, the navvies dug deeper, the tunnels grew longer, and the great, hidden arteries of Bazalgette's system began to take shape beneath the city's feet. They were not just digging. They were building something that was meant to last for centuries. And to do that, in the wet, challenging, and unstable ground beneath London, they needed a revolutionary new material, a kind of artificial waterproof stone, one of the great inventions of the Victorian age. The army of navvies had the muscle and the skill to dig the great tunnels. But to build a sewer system that could survive for a century or more in the wet, shifting, and deeply corrosive ground beneath London, they needed more than just bricks and brute force. They needed a miracle. They needed a new kind of mortar. The traditional lime mortar that had been used for centuries had a fatal flaw for this particular project. It was relatively weak, and it cured very, very slowly through a process of air drying. In the constantly damp and often soaking wet conditions of a deep tunnel, it would simply never harden properly. To build a sewer with it would be to build a leaky, crumbling, and ultimately doomed structure. What Bazalgette needed was a mortar that could set and become hard even when fully submerged in water. Fortunately, the industrial age had provided just such a miracle. It was called Portland cement. This revolutionary new material had been patented in Britain a few decades earlier, but it was here, in the great dark tunnels of the London sewer system, that it would have its first truly massive industrial-scale application. Portland cement was made by heating a mixture of limestone and clay to incredibly high temperatures in a great kiln. The resulting substance, when ground into a fine powder and mixed with water, sand, and gravel, created a concrete of unprecedented strength. And most importantly, it was a hydraulic cement, meaning it could set and harden through a chemical reaction with the water itself, making it completely waterproof and incredibly durable. It was, in essence, a form of liquid artificial stone. This new cement was a complete game changer. It was the superhero of building materials. Its main superpower was getting really hard, even when it's soaking wet. It's a less glamorous power than flight or super strength, but for a Victorian sewer engineer, it was the greatest gift imaginable. Joseph Bazalgette, with his typical meticulous foresight, recognized the immense potential of this new material. He set incredibly high standards for the quality of the Portland cement to be used on his project. He had a special laboratory set up to rigorously test the tensile strength of every single batch delivered by the manufacturers. Any batch that did not meet his exacting specifications was rejected. This fanatical commitment to quality control not only ensured the longevity of his own project but also helped to standardize the production of high-quality, reliable cement for the entire world. You can imagine the scene deep in a tunnel. Behind the miners digging at the face, the bricklayers work by lamplight. They lay the millions of high-quality bricks in their distinctive egg-shaped pattern, and they bind them together with this new, powerful mortar. The mortar sets quickly and creates a bond as strong as the bricks themselves. The result was not just a brick tunnel, it was a single monolithic waterproof stone tube, a structure of immense strength and integrity. The name, Portland Cement, was actually a clever bit of 19th century marketing. It was not made in Portland. The inventor, a man named Joseph Aspdin, named it that because he claimed the grayish, stone-like concrete made from it closely resembled Portland stone, a prestigious and very expensive limestone that was used to build many of London's grandest buildings. It's like inventing a new kind of cheap sausage and calling it prime rib sausage to make it sound more appealing. It was a brilliant marketing move. Engineering historians often debate the most crucial innovation of the London sewer project. Was it Bazalgette's grand, overarching design of the intercepting sewers? Was it the sheer brute force and skill of the army of the navvies? Or was it the application of this new material, Portland cement, which gave the tunnels their incredible, almost Roman-like longevity? The truth is that all three were essential. The plan was the brain, the navvies were the muscle, and the cement was the strong, unbreakable bone. Bazalgette built his sewers to last. He wasn't interested in a quick fix for the smell of 1858. He was building an underground monument that would probably outlast most of the grand Victorian buildings on the surface. He was playing the long game. The very long and very smelly game. As the navvies dug deeper, carving these modern tunnels with their modern materials, they were also quite literally digging back in time. With every scoop of their shovels, they were cutting through the layers of London's long and complex history, unearthing the secrets of the older cities that lay buried just a few feet beneath their own. As the navvies dug their way across London, they were not just moving through earth and clay, they were cutting a great horizontal cross-section through time. With every scoop of their shovels and every strike of their pickaxes, they became accidental archaeologists, unearthing the ghosts of the many Londons that had come before. Imagine the scene. A team of navvies is digging a deep, muddy trench down the middle of a busy street. Suddenly, a shovel hits something hard and flat that is not a paving stone. The foreman is called over. They carefully clear away the thick, wet London clay, and there, revealed for the first time in 1500 years, are the bright, beautiful colors of an intricate Roman mosaic floor. The construction of the city's future was literally unearthing its most ancient past. The massive excavations for the sewer system were one of the most important, if chaotic and poorly documented, archaeological events in London's history. They provided the Victorian world with its first real large-scale glimpse of the Roman city of Londinium that lay buried just a few feet beneath their own bustling metropolis, The finds were constant and extraordinary. The navvies uncovered the foundations of Roman villas and bathhouses. They found sections of the original Roman city wall and the wooden pilings of the first Roman bridges over the Thames. And they found a treasure trove of smaller, more personal artifacts. Elegant Samianware pottery, thousands of Roman coins, leather sandals perfectly preserved in the anaerobic mud, discarded oyster shells from a Roman feast 2,000 years ago, and occasionally, the grim discovery of human skeletons from ancient plagues or forgotten battles. It was the ultimate lucky dip. One shovelful was just dirt. The next might contain a priceless Roman vase or the skull of a medieval knight. It certainly made the work more interesting than just digging through clay. In the early days of the project, there was no formal archaeological process. Many of the smaller items, like coins or brooches, were simply pocketed by the navvies who found them, later sold for a few pennies to buy a pint of beer. It was a kind of unofficial bonus for their hard work. Larger finds, like mosaics or the foundations of a significant building, would often cause a brief pause in the work. Interested gentlemen antiquarians from the city's many learned societies would be called to the site to quickly sketch and document the find before it was, more often than not, unceremoniously smashed to pieces to make way for the inexorable advance of the new brick sewer. Archaeologists and historians today often lament the lost opportunities of these great 19th century infrastructure projects. How many priceless artifacts, how many irreplaceable insights into the city's past, were destroyed and lost forever because there was no formal archaeological oversight. The focus of the age was on engineering progress, and the preservation of history was, at best, a secondary and often inconvenient concern. The discoveries were not limited to the Roman era. The navvies found Saxon jewelry, Viking weapons from the time of the Danelaw, and the foundations of medieval churches. Perhaps the most astonishing find of all came during the excavations for the northern main sewer. There, deep in the clay, the workers found the remarkably complete skeleton of a woolly mammoth. Lying nearby were the primitive flint tools that suggested that prehistoric Londoners had once hunted these great hairy beasts along the banks of an ancient, much colder, and much cleaner River Thames. Discovering a mammoth skeleton must have been quite a surprise. "Oi, governor, we've hit a bit of a problem. Seems there's a very large, very extinct elephant in the way of the new sewer line. What's the official protocol for that?" These discoveries gave Londoners a new and profound sense of the immense depth of their own history. The city was not just a Victorian creation. It was a layer cake of civilizations, and they were living on the very top. Gives you a new perspective. The next time you are stuck in traffic in a great city, you can just imagine all the history you are sitting on top of. I may be late for my meeting, but at least I'm parked directly above what was probably a Roman public toilet. It's a nice thought. But the navvy's job was not to look at the past. They were building the future. And while the most important parts of their work were destined to be hidden forever underground, the most visible, magnificent, and beautiful parts of Bazalgette's great plan were about to rise from the ground, great temples of industry that would house the mighty steam engines needed to power the entire system. While most of Joseph Bazalgette's great work was destined to be hidden forever, a silent, unseen network of tunnels beneath the ground, the beating heart of his system was proudly displayed on the surface for all to see. To solve the problem of London's low-lying areas, where gravity alone was not enough to move the waste, Bazalgette needed to build pumps. And he didn't just build pumping stations, he built magnificent cathedrals of steam and sewage. You are standing now before the Abbey Mills pumping station in East London. It is not the grim, functional, industrial shed you might expect. It is one of the most beautiful and ornate buildings in the entire city. Designed by Bazalgette and his architect, Charles Driver, it is a breathtaking masterpiece of Victorian architecture. It is a stunning cross-shaped building with a central, octagonal dome, intricate stonework, and elegant arched windows, built in a unique style that blends Byzantine, Gothic, and even Moorish influences. It became known, with a mixture of awe and gentle amusement, as the Cathedral of Sewage. This was the Victorian engineering philosophy in its grandest form. Bazalgette and his contemporaries believed that their great works of public infrastructure were not just utilities, they were monuments. They were testaments to the power, ingenuity, and civic pride of the greatest city in the world. They believed that even a humble sewer pump deserved to be housed in a building that was as beautiful and inspiring as a church. You step inside. The interior is just as magnificent. It is a vast, light-filled hall, with a high vaulted ceiling and galleries supported by columns of polished granite. But the centerpiece of this cathedral is not an altar, but a set of immense, powerful, and beautiful machines, the great beam engines. These were the giants of the industrial age. Huge steam-powered engines with flywheels over 30 feet in diameter, their great rocking beams rising and falling in a slow, hypnotic, and almost silent rhythm. Their polished brass fittings would have gleamed in the light from the tall windows, and their power was immense, lifting millions of gallons of London's waste every day, allowing gravity to take it the rest of the way to the sea. The decorative ironwork inside the station was a work of art in itself. The cast iron support columns and railings were not just functional. They were covered in beautiful, intricate patterns of flowers and foliage, a delicate touch of natural beauty in the heart of this massive industrial machine. It's like putting a tiny, exquisitely framed painting inside the engine of your car. No one but the mechanic will ever see it, but you know it's there. And it is a mark of true quality. Architectural historians still debate the motivations behind this cathedral-like style for industrial buildings. Was it a genuine expression of Victorian pride in their own engineering prowess, a gospel of work that saw these great machines as worthy of their own temples? Or was it a way to mask the dirty, noisy reality of the industrial age in a more palatable, romantic, and almost religious architectural style, looking back to the Gothic past to conceal the grimy present? Being an engineer at one of these stations must have been a magnificent job. You would get to work in a beautiful, light-filled building, tending to some of the most powerful and impressive machines on the planet, all while performing a vital public service. The only downside is that your beautiful cathedral is dedicated entirely to pumping sewage. 4 of these great pumping stations were built as part of the system, 2 on each side of the river. They were the muscles of Bazalgette's great organism, the relentless 24-hour-day heartbeat that kept the entire system flowing. The tunnels were dug. The pumps were ready to be installed. The project was nearing its completion. But there was one last, great, and highly visible piece of the puzzle to be put into place. The main intercepting sewers had to run along the edge of the river itself, and Bazalgette's plan for housing them would not just solve the problem of the stink, it would fundamentally reshape the face of London forever. It was time to tame the Thames itself. The great tunnels were dug, the magnificent pumping station stood ready, but the final and most publicly visible part of Joseph Bazalgette's master plan was yet to be built. He needed to lay his largest and most important sewer, the Great Low-Level Sewer, along the very edge of the north bank of the River Thames. And in doing so, he would not just hide a pipe. He would fundamentally reshape and tame the river itself. Before Bazalgette, the northern bank of the Thames in central London was a chaotic and muddy mess. It was a jumble of rickety wooden wharves, private docks, boat-building yards, and at low tide vast stinking mudflats. It was an industrial shoreline, not a civic space. Bazalgette's solution was as audacious as it was brilliant. He would build a massive new river wall out in the river, reclaiming acres of the muddy foreshore. Within this newly created strip of land, he would run his main sewer, alongside a new underground railway line and a tunnel for utility pipes. And on top, he would build a grand, beautiful, tree-lined roadway and public promenade. This would become the Victoria Embankment. It was a typically ambitious and multitasking Victorian solution. The initial problem was, we need a place to put one very large sewer pipe. The final solution was, let's just build a whole new riverbank, reclaim 37 acres of valuable land, create a new park, ease London's traffic, and put a train inside it while we're at it. They did not believe in half measures. The construction, which took place throughout the 1860s, was a monumental feat of engineering. Great coffer dams had to be built out into the river to hold back the water. The area behind them was pumped dry, and then the navvies could begin the work of building the massive, curved granite retaining wall that would form the new edge of the city. They had to work constantly against the powerful tides of the river. The project had multiple, profound benefits for London. Firstly, and most importantly, it housed the crucial final link of the sewer system, carrying the waste of the city safely away to the east. Secondly, it created a wide modern road that dramatically eased the city's notorious traffic congestion. Thirdly, it created beautiful new public gardens for Londoners to enjoy, a green, pleasant space where once there had been only mud and industrial grime. And fourthly, it had a remarkable beneficial effect on the river itself. By narrowing the Thames, the embankment increased the speed and the scouring power of its current. The faster-moving water was now able to carry away silt and keep the riverbed cleaner, a process the wide, sluggish river could no longer manage on its own. Bazalgette's incredible attention to detail extended to the very furniture of his new creation. The beautiful, ornate, cast-iron benches that still line the Victoria Embankment today, with their distinctive sphinx-shaped armrests, were part of his original design. Even the benches had to be grand and symbolic. They couldn't just be benches. They had to be benches that subtly reminded you of the grandeur and global reach of the British Empire. It's hard to relax on a bench when it's quietly trying to tell you about the geopolitical importance of the Suez Canal. Urban historians often debate the social consequences of this great beautification project. While it was a triumph of engineering and a wonderful new public amenity, its construction also swept away the old, messy, working-class world of the riverbank. The communities of watermen, ferrymen, and mudlarks who had made their living on the river for centuries were displaced, their livelihoods rendered obsolete by the new, clean, modern riverfront. It was progress, but a progress that came at a cost. You can walk along the Victoria Embankment today. You can admire the beautiful granite walls, the ornate dolphin street lamps, the green trees, and the magnificent views of the city. It is one of the great romantic walks in London. And the most romantic thing about it is that, thanks to Joseph Bazalgette, as you are strolling along, you are walking directly on top of the main sewer line for the entire city, a hidden but essential part of the atmosphere. With the embankments nearing completion in the late 1860s, the great project was essentially finished. The tunnels were operational, the pumps were steaming away, and the river was clean. London had been transformed. But the greatest, most profound, and most miraculous consequence of Bazalgette's work was one that he himself had never intended or even fully understood. It was a miracle that happened not by design, but by a beautiful life-saving accident. Joseph Bazalgette's Great Sewer Project was a stunning success in its primary and very specific mission. It got rid of the smell. But in solving the great, overwhelming problem that the Victorians could see and smell, they accidentally and miraculously solved a much more terrible and invisible problem. They cured the city of the king of all diseases, cholera. The entire massive, fantastically expensive sewer project had been motivated by the flawed miasma theory. Parliament had authorized the spending of millions of pounds to defeat a bad air, to purify a poisonous stench that they believed was carrying disease into their homes and lungs. But they were wrong. The real enemy was not in the air. It was in the water. A few years before the Great Stink in 1854, a brilliant London doctor named John Snow had already figured this out. During a terrifying and concentrated cholera outbreak in the Soho district, Snow did not theorize about the air. He did something radical. He made a map. He went from house to house, meticulously plotting the location of every single death. And his map revealed a stunning pattern. The deaths were all clustered around a single, popular public water pump on Broad Street. Snow presented his evidence to the local authorities and convinced them to take the handle off the pump, making it unusable. the cholera outbreak in that neighborhood almost immediately stopped. He had proven, with a beautiful piece of early epidemiology, that cholera was not a miasma. It was a waterborne disease spread by drinking water that had been contaminated with sewage from cholera victims, but the scientific establishment of the time was deeply committed to the miasma theory, and Snow's revolutionary work was largely ignored and dismissed. It's a classic case of people preferring a complicated, dramatic, and incorrect explanation over a simple, slightly disgusting, and correct one. An invisible plague carried on the very air we breathe. Sounds much more epic than stop drinking the water from that one pump, it's got poo in it. The branding for the miasma theory was just much better. And so, we come to the great beautiful irony at the heart of our story. Bazalgette and the politicians built the entire sewer system for the wrong reason. They built it to get the sewage far away from the city so its smelly miasma wouldn't cause disease. But in doing so, they also, completely by accident, stopped the sewage from getting into the River Thames above the intakes for the city's water companies. By diverting the raw sewage away from the drinking water supply, they unknowingly removed the primary transmission route for the cholera bacteria. They had set out to cure a smell. They had accidentally cured a plague. The final tragic proof of this came in 1866. A new cholera epidemic broke out in a small area of London's East End. But this time the outbreak did not spread. It remained confined to that one neighborhood. Investigators, now armed with the growing acceptance of Snow's work, quickly discovered the reason. This neighborhood was the one and only part of London that had not yet been connected to Bazalgette's new sewer system. It was the ultimate, unintentional scientific control group. The sewers were the cure. John Snow had been right all along. Historians of science and medicine see this as a landmark moment. But they debate its role in the scientific revolution of the time. Did the accidental success of the sewer system, a project motivated by miasma theory, actually delay the full acceptance of the germ theory by seeming to prove that the anti-miasma approach of just cleaning up the city worked? Or did that final localized epidemic of 1866 provide the last, undeniable piece of evidence needed to finally convince the establishment that germs were real? Whatever the case, the result was undeniable. The great cholera epidemics that had haunted London for a generation, killing tens of thousands, vanished. Joseph Bazalgette probably saved more lives than any doctor of the 19th century, and he did it all by accident while working to solve a different problem, based on a completely wrong theory. It is surely the greatest and most beneficial public health mistake in all of history. The project was a triumph, not just of engineering over a bad smell, but of sanitation over a deadly disease. But as the years passed, as a new generation of Londoners grew up who had never known the fear of cholera or the horror of the Great Stink, this incredible life-saving system would slowly sink into the background, forgotten, working its silent, unseen magic beneath the feet of the millions of people who owed it their very lives. And so the great crisis ends not with a bang, but with the quiet, triumphant flush of a clean river and the miraculous disappearance of a terrible disease. The Great Stink was defeated, and its memory, along with the vast, heroic system it created, would slowly sink beneath the surface of the city, becoming an invisible and unsung marvel. Joseph Bazalgette was knighted for his work, becoming Sir Joseph. He is not, perhaps, as famous as other great Victorian engineers like Isambard Kingdom Brunel, the builder of great ships and bridges. But Bazalgette's creation has arguably saved more lives, and had a more profound impact on the daily existence of Londoners than any other feat of engineering. His grand sewer system is the single most important piece of infrastructure in the city's modern history. And incredibly, the core of that system, the great brick intercepting sewers he designed in the 1850s, is still in use today. While it is now being supplemented by a new super sewer, to cope with the city's ever-growing population, the fact that these Victorian brick tunnels have successfully served a world-class city for over 150 years is the ultimate testament to the brilliance of Bazalgette's design and the quality of his work. It is the greatest and most successful public works project that no one ever thinks about, which is, for a sewer system, the highest possible compliment. The only time you think about a sewer is when it's not working, and Bazalgette's system has been quietly and competently working for a century and a half. The entire magnificent network, the beautiful pumping stations, the grand embankments, the millions of bricks laid in the dark, is, in a way, a vast and sprawling monument. It is a monument to a single terrible summer, and a monument to a very, very bad smell. Even today the work continues. The self-cleaning, egg-shaped tunnels still require occasional maintenance. Modern London employs teams of workers, known affectionately as flushers, who are the direct descendants of the Victorian navvies. They descend into Bazalgette's tunnels to clear blockages, most famously the giant, disgusting buildups of cooking fat and waste known as fatbergs, and to inspect the sturdy Victorian brickwork. Being a modern sewer flusher is a tough job, but it is also like being a curator for a magnificent, hidden, and still functioning museum. The story of the Great Stink is now used by urban planners and historians as a key case study. It is a powerful example of how a short-term, acute environmental crisis can force a reluctant society to make a massive, long-overdue investment in sustainable infrastructure. The debate it sparked continues today. Must we always wait for a catastrophe to strike before we are willing to act for the future? Imagine yourself now on a quiet evening, walking along the Victoria Embankment in modern London. The air is clean. You can see the lights of the city glittering on the surface of a river that is now clean enough for fish to live in. You see the grand buildings, the bridges, the life of the city all around you. And you can do so without holding a perfumed handkerchief to your nose. So the next time you visit London, or any great modern city, take a moment to appreciate the clean air. And remember the quiet, unseen world beneath your feet. Remember that you are walking on a masterpiece of engineering, a solution born of desperation, a triumph of science by accident, and a lasting invisible monument to the time a bad smell changed the world. And as you stand there on the embankment, watching the lights of the city glitter on the surface of a living, breathing river, our story of the Great Stink of 1858 comes to its gentle and quiet close. The memory of the foul, brown water, the comical image of the lime-soaked curtains, the roar of the navvy's work, and the quiet, mustachioed competence of the great engineer, all of these can now settle like dust into the quiet pages of history. The crisis is over. The great unseen marvel is still there, doing its silent, thankless work in the darkness below. The city is safe, and now you can rest.